Hey everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Building It Up with Bertelsmann, India's first growth-focused podcast. I'm your host, Ankur Variku, and with me today are two individuals who I think would represent and reflect my definition of tenacity, of perseverance, of being absolutely at it and never giving up. Aloke and Rajnish, the co-founders of Ixigo.com. Aloke and Rajnish met each other at IIT Kanpur, which is where they were graduating, and then they went to Amadeus, which is a very large global travel company. Before somewhat going their way, Alok went to do his MBA at INSEAD while Rajnish continued to be the technologist. And then in 2007, they came back to India, and that's when they started Ixigo. So what's today considered an overnight success is actually 12 years old. And their journey has been nothing but a lot of hardships, a lot of painful decisions, a lot of soul searching, and that's what we're going to delve in. So, welcome Alok, welcome Rajnish to Building It Up with Bertelsmann. It's a pleasure to have you. You guys first met each other in IIT Kanpur. Did you have any sparks, any conversations back then that one day we will get together, a startup? What was the thought of starting a travel company when it was somewhat, I would say, crowded or definitely competitive? But did you have something in mind that got you that hint or that conviction ki ye karte hain?
So I think initially, we just wanted to start something of our own. It was not like we were fixated on an idea, and that discussion had been going on for almost a year. And India was booming, so we wanted to be back here because we thought we were missing out on all the action because Europe was growing at like single digit rate of growth, and that's how we ended up back here. And then once we were here, we started brainstorming as to what should we do, and figured out that travel being something we understood, and also because the Air Deccan and all these new airlines that were coming up, had sort of proved that aviation would take off here. There were OTAs that just raised money. We didn't want to build yet another OTA. That is something we were very clear about.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that was common was that both of us wanted to disrupt Amadeus first. That was the first goal.
Got it.
It was too ambitious, too big. That is how we started. But when we came down here in India and we started looking at the ecosystem, we saw that there are a lot of low-hanging problems that we can actually solve rather than getting so deep on the supply side or ecosystem level stuff. So we started looking at user problems, which is all these new sites that came up, 5, 6 low-cost carriers, and then 5, 6 OTAs were also there in the market. So we said, how about comparing all of them in one place? Which was basically, Indians are deal hunters by nature. And this is something we believed would definitely work here, and it was solving a real problem, user problem. Right? So that's how we pivoted the idea from Amadeus killer to a price comparison engine for India.
And was the focus early on just flights, because that's where the price comparison was easiest?
Yes.
Yeah. There was no price comparison on trains.
It was also because the flight user was already online, or some of them were already online. Because I think when we started, there were 20 million internet users in India back in 2007.
We could meet all of them
if we wanted.
And they were the most evolved sort of it was desktop only.
Correct.
So flight was a better fit, obviously, to start with back then, and soon we would branch out into hotels and other things that made sense over the next few years. Trains didn't happen till 2013.
Yeah, till much later. Well, we did something on trains in the early days, but I think it started making a lot more sense when mobile became a thing, because a lot of the users who didn't have access to internet, you won't expect somebody to buy a laptop or a desktop because it's too expensive for them. I think the bottom of the pyramid came online only 12, 13 onwards when the mobile phones started to come, and that's where we saw the opportunity. But I think the initial phase was really interesting, because when we launched this flight app, everybody asked us, like, how did you seed it, right? How did you initially get all those users, and how did you start growing? And
that's my question as well. And go on, answer.
So, we seeded it with like a small set of users, our own networks, right? Obviously, that was the first thing. But the reason why it grew was not that network. The reason why it grew was that there was a lot of word of mouth. So what happened is that we saw that India mein the internet connection was a big problem. Sites were really slow. I mean, we saw some of the major airline and OTA sites. The homepage used to take about 15 seconds to open. Okay, so we did something very clever. What we did is we found out the hosting services of all these companies.
Got it.
All of them were in the West Coast in the US.
Yeah.
So we took a server in the West Coast right next to theirs, and we started scraping them from there locally. So it was lightning fast. And then we would have like a server just for the front end in India.
Wow.
So you just get the data from there and just serve it up on a single page application. So our site would show comparison from like 10 different places
Faster
in less than 3 seconds, whereas individually these sites took like 15 seconds to just open the home page.
Wow.
And people like, how are they doing it? And this was happening from a desktop which was in our office under the table.
Are you serious?
On a DSL
Yes,
internet
on a
connection.
DSL internet
That is
connection. We were giving investor presentation on this, right? So I would stay back, make sure that nobody hits the server or the power cord so it doesn't go down. So it was quite crazy.
That is
Quite crazy.
insane. That is quite a story. And you know what? The story to me symbolizes what the Ixigo story is all about. Like I would call you founders with insane level of tenacity and perseverance. Like, you started in 2007.
Yeah.
Today, people call you an overnight success, but you are a 12-year-old overnight success.
True.
Right? And that is crazy. Right? It's just you've been consistently at it for so long with that conviction that very few people have, and you've done it in a way that you've controlled the pace. Like you literally called your own shots. We are going to be a word of marketing business. We are going to be a viral marketing tool. We're going to be a brand that stands for virtually every Indian out there, millions of them who are traveling on trains and buses and flights and so on. Is that who you are fundamentally as people or personalities, or is it something that you felt that the company needed to have to withstand all the competition and all these years?
I think it boils down to two things. One is circumstances,
Yeah.
right? And two is the DNA, right?
Mhm.
That the team or the individuals had. So when I say circumstances, right, when we started, all the OTAs had raised a lot of money,
Yeah.
right? In their Series A round, most of them had raised $5-10 million bucks, and by the time we were 1 year old, they had raised their Series B round as well, and we had raised a small seed round of $500,000 by then, right? And then the financial crisis came, right?
Right.
So Lehman Brothers collapsed and all of that, and we were like literally down to the last month of cash, and at that point we had this moment of reckoning where everyone, like, it was a very small team, right? We all got into a room and said, hey, fight or flight, right? So are we done here, or are we gonna just give it more fight and keep going? And I think what we had managed to do was build a small team that believed in the mission so much
Yeah.
that they said there is no way that a company where you're getting so much organic user love should just shut shop and go home just
Right.
because it ran out of money, right? There must be ways to make this work. I remember there was this young engineer who just stands up and says, I can work without salary for the next 6 months if that's a problem. And I
Wow.
was like, yaar, tere ko ghar ka kiraya bhi to dena hoga, right? How
Correct.
will that work?
Yeah.
So then we found the solution. Actually, everyone was down to less than half of their salary for almost a year.
Yeah, in fact, that was the guy who said that give us some time, we'll get back to you. So
Okay.
they went back, they had a meeting internally.
The
then
employees.
The
Yeah.
employees.
Yeah.
Then they came back to us and they said, we have a plan, you don't need to let go of anyone.
Sure.
We'll all work for half the salary.
Wow.
That way, you don't need to fire
We
anyone.
gave
is
all of them
unbelievable.
ESOPs
Yeah.
immediately when this thing happened. We went to our landlord and we said, we are vacating this small office, we're moving to a smaller one. And he's like, nahi yaar, kya ho gaya? And we said, I don't have money. And he said, pay us what you can. Literally, those were his words. He's like,
Wow.
pay us what you can, for the next few months, I'll manage, right? So we almost for the same duration, we paid lesser rent, just managed to have that fighting spirit to survive. But what that circumstances did is it forced us to think of more ingenious ways to do things, right? So here we were trying to compete on marketing with $0 marketing budgets. So we were like, what do we do? And then we get into a room saying, what can you do without spending money, right? And we came up with all these techniques, which today, obviously are still working at scale, which were things like, hey, how do you leverage word of mouth and promote word of mouth more? how do you build content that goes viral, right? And in those days, Facebook was a 1 or 2 year old business, right? But we were one of the first platforms to start leveraging it really to make content go viral. And then we were like, SEO, which a lot of companies didn't pay a lot of attention to back then. We said, if you rank well on Google, you can get a lot of traffic for free. So I remember, I used to actually spend hours a day sitting with people saying, how can we rank better on Google for these queries? Because, if we crack that, and it's more art than science actually, then you can actually get a lot of traffic for free. And I think the thing we really did right was that the product and tech guys really created something that people loved, right? So I think we've been able to consistently understand what consumers want and move in that direction, right? And if you remain static, assuming this is what they want, beyond the point you become irrelevant. But over the journey, we've sort of every time figured out what do they want tomorrow, right? And can we start building it today? So that's how we. So I think circumstances and ingenuity, right? So being able to find a way out.
Got it.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, like more companies died because of overfunding than underfunding, right? So when you have your back against the wall, you don't have an option, and you need to figure out ways of recovering from that.
Absolutely.
And for us, like one thing that these hardships taught us is that it made us a lot more resilient. And resilience is one of the things in our DNA as a company as well. And what we have figured out is that it brings people together. So when in times of crisis, people take it as a challenge. It brings them together, and they want to fight it back. And what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. They always come back stronger at the other end. And the other thing that we have realized is that, again, those hardships taught us, like back then we had no idea. We just knew that if you just be transparent when it comes to exchanging information, that's the best thing that works. So we would never hide anything.
And that's the moment when everyone can and thinks like an entrepreneur, which is
exactly
best spot to be in for any.
Exactly, because then you don't need to do anything. There are no sticks, there are no carrots, there are no processes.
There are no managers required.
There are no managers,
required,
nothing.
There are no policies, and everyone's just taking care of themselves.
It in fact reflected in our culture, because I still remember we never had a product manager till about 3 years ago.
Are you serious? No, I don't believe that, honestly.
Till 3 years back.
Till 3 years back, we had no product managers because every engineer was a product guy.
Wow.
They would think like every engineer was a customer support guy.
Very
every engineer was a designer. Every engineer was
commendable.
So I think that's one of the things about our culture. Like we kind of created this culture of full stack thinking.
Yeah.
Even if you're not completely full stack, you can still think about at least the adjacent functions.
Yeah.
That gives you a holistic view on things, and you're able to get the big picture and do way better than you were doing with your.
I want to lift this up. So full stack thinking rather than full stack skills, because full stack skills may be a personal choice, but every human is capable of full stack thinking.
Absolutely.
And if you can create a culture that encourages that, then that is fantastic. One question on this is, like, as I hear you guys, it seems like a lot of what good has happened at Ixigo has been the culture, which may have been serendipitous because of the circumstances you were in, and of course the DNA and the personality and how people reacted. Do you also feel that if, just hypothetically thinking, and maybe a hard one to answer, if things were not growing as well as you were witnessing, do you, for an entrepreneur who's in the middle of this chaos, still recommend that don't give up? Like, at what point of time do you come face to face with the reality, and how do you even start to measure reality? Because everyone, we're all entrepreneurs.
I think that it's a very good question, right? Because when you start the company, you believe in what you're building so much that you are literally blinded by it, right? And you're not looking at data, you're looking at this unshakable belief that this is going to work, right? Which is great, right? Because that makes you create, in that 0 to 1 phase. But at moments of these reckonings that we've had, not one but several along the journey, I think you have to go back and see what is working.
We have been through a phase. We are terrible at killing products. We are terrible at that.
Most entrepreneurs are.
Most entrepreneurs are, because we think we are superhuman and we can do everything. अच्छा ये भी है, I can do this as well, I can do this as well. हाँ बिल्कुल, I can do this. If they can do it, I can also do it, right? So you know, we had that attitude all the time, and I mean it's still hard to kind of let go of that, to be honest. But in the process, we figured out that, you know, we were actually trying to build multiple companies in every vertical inside, and we started looking outside you. That's when you see that, you know, it's not always about MVP, right? Sometimes it's about minimum lovable product, right? And not just minimum viable product. So you know, that's when we figured out, when we, and it pained us because we are very obsessed with customer experience, right? So it pained us to see that there was another guy doing only one thing and doing it so well that, you know, it would actually demotivate the team. So the downside was of having a demotivated team build and maintain a shitty product. Nobody wants to be in that situation. So, you know, we took that call, we learned it the hard way, really hard way. It took us a while to take that call and shut the product down, but we did it.
Yeah. And when that happened, was it because you had the confidence that other products were working, or you knew that this product has to shut down because it's not working?
So there are multiple scenarios. So one is that you bite more than you can chew.
Sure.
Okay. You know this works, you just don't have the time and
Don't have
priority
the
to do
bandwidth,
that.
and you
Don't
need
have
to
the
acknowledge that.
And you have to acknowledge that, right? The second is that it's uncharted territory, right? In which case you don't know about it, but the thing is that this recklessness, the young and reckless attitude which you have when you just start, it kind of changes over time, and you know, you start becoming a little more data driven as founders, and that also is a downside because then you're not really taking a risk, a blind risk, and that's what changes over time, which makes us say that no, this is not going to work. Let's shut it down. Although, you know, it does take a lot of courage to do that because you still have people internally who are aligned and who feel that it can work. But you know, everything is true or false in hindsight, right?
Yeah, it has to be an emotionless decision.
It has to be. It has to be. So you spoke about 2013 when you began to see that inflection where trains could possibly be a good category to expand into, while you're already dabbling into that, but cheapness, if I would call, of smartphones, and then of course Geo coming in and changing it and internet revolution. At that point of time, I imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, you may have had choices of either expanding horizontally, which is, hey, you're doing flights while you're doing other things as well. Let's just go into trains, which is a much larger segment. Or maybe you could have had options of going international. Maybe you could have options of going into other markets. How did you really go about choosing this? Because this was not now a new company where you could take enough risk.
So I'll roll back again to 2008, right? You're
Yeah.
left with no money and you have to find ways to grow.
Yeah.
So we tried almost all of these things, right? Like Rajnish was saying, you know, maybe we were doing too much. So we went international. We launched in Europe, a market that we knew.
Oh, is it?
We lived
Yeah,
there.
because I imagine.
We launched like 5 geographies in Europe.
In different languages, huh?
When was this? No idea.
Nobody knows about it.
Knows about it.
Wow.
So
It was just on the staging
In
servers.
5.
that was in production
In
for
5 languages.
Yeah.
5 languages. We were in
Wow,
Germany,
okay.
France, and whatnot.
Yeah.
And we launched a train section on web, even though it was desktop era.
Sure.
We launched a train section on web, and the reason we did it is that because of this SEO growth hacking that we started to do, we realized that there was a far bigger amount of traffic that was out there searching for trains, even with that small internet base, than there was for flights, right? And even today, if you look at, 400,000 people travel on flights every day, and there's like 26 million people take a train every day, right? So the order of magnitude has always been there, right? It was even more stark back then. So we were like, if you're building a travel company and you're not catering for how people actually travel, which is actually train, right, then you're not building a travel company, right? So that realization dawned. We launched trains on web. On web, it quickly grew to almost half of our traffic by the time mobile came. And then as soon as mobile came, it started growing even faster. So it was also backed by a little bit of data, but then the intuition said that, hey, nobody's trying to solve for the train traveler first, right? Because then, and why is the assumption that if in the Western world a flight first OTA is how you build the business, that's what will work in India. Why shouldn't we challenge that assumption and try to think with a train first hat?
Correct.
So that's how we started thinking about the problem. And then when we talk to people who travel on trains, fortunately both of us come from smaller towns. He's from Patna and from Lucknow, and we've traveled in trains quite a lot to empathize with you know what the problems are, and the problems perennially were don't know where the train is, don't know how late it is, don't know which platform it will come on.
Get on the train, wake up in the morning, the train is at the same place. Those sort of things we've been through.
I want to be reminded because I'll miss the station. It comes at 3 a.m.
Exactly,
So, you know, these basic pain areas that existed for eternity, right? Even booking a ticket was a pain, but, you know, that was, for us, that was a solved problem because we knew that IRCTC was there. You could still book it. But when we looked at all these other pain areas, we were like, you know, who's going to solve for that?
The product experience of traveling in a train.
Totally broken.
Totally broken.
Totally broken. So that was the insight with which we started building that app. And actually, it was more than just that. The insight was there for a long time. One fine day, you know, Rajnish and a couple of developers say, hey, it's been a while, we've been toying with this idea. Why don't we get into a room and come out with something? Right?
So we literally locked ourselves up. I still remember it was entire January. 45 days, January, bit of December and January, right? So it was me and 3 more guys, and we said that, you know, we looked at apps as an ecosystem and say apps is a different beast. It's not like web, right? So app is like a use case. Every app is a use case. So we said let's think of different use cases. So everybody, you know, we thought of use cases and everybody picked a use case. So first 15 days we learned Android because nobody had any idea what Android was. And then the next 30 days, all of us ended up building one app each.
Wow.
Okay. And so the app that, so all of them died down, except one app, which was basically what that app did was it was actually very nifty. It was a small app. All it did was would read SMSs, travel related only, obviously, just being privacy conscious here. And it would convert them into trips, and then it would start tracking them automatically. So what would happen is somebody would install the app. He has never opened the app. One fine day he gets a notification which says train ticket is confirmed, or he would get a notification which says your web check-in is open now. Okay, and you tap there and it directly takes you to, you know, the seat selection page of the airline. And people are like, wow, this app is like, for the first time there was an app that you didn't have to use. It was preemptive, right? So it became runaway success. It became runaway success. But then after that it started growing. There was another internal conflict inside the organization, which is that we know that this is not going to make any money for us. On the other hand, I have a business where I'm making good money, which is flights, hotels side of the business. But on this side, I'm not making any money. So internally, even and engineers are smart, they understand that. So it would be very hard for people to be aligned with a product which is not making the company any money. They would feel a little bit worthless. You know, what's my use in the company if I'm not building something which is giving me any value? So it was a hard call, but you know, that is where the culture of innovation came in. We said that, you know, it's not always about making money, it's about taking longer term bets. So innovation is solving problems which have very low ROI in the short term, but very high ROI in the long term. Like, because all the high ROI, short term high ROI problems will always be at the top of the roadmap of any company, and all the longer terms would be at the bottom, which means they'll never ever get implemented, right? And it takes a lot of guts and courage as an organization to kind of align disproportionate amount of resources to build something like that, just because you see, you know, 5 years down the line, people will be talking about next billion users.
Wow, who would have thought? Who would have thought?
Right. So, you know, that's the call we took in 2013, that we'll go after the bottom of the pyramid now, because it's a problem to be solved.
At that point of time, did you feel that the other verticals were beginning to get beginning to become a distraction, or were you like, no, these are the ones that are fueling the cash? So
for a while, you know, we were in this phase where you know, flights was driving most of our revenue, whereas trains was driving most of our traffic growth, right? And finding a balance between the two was a topic of constant debate, saying, you know, where should we put our resources towards, etc. But I think one thing both of us sort of fundamentally believed in was that flights was an opportunity where, you know, from a competition standpoint, from a long-term growth standpoint, though it was exciting, you know, if you look at the number of flight passengers that would still be taking flights 10 years down the line and you compared it with trains, trains would still be an order of magnitude bigger, right? And then you're like, can I solve for actually a larger set of users, and then leverage that in the future to maybe even sell more flights?
In this entire journey of 12 years, you've clearly made some really hard calls, you've gone through hard times, you still are at it, and of course, you're doing commendably well now. Um, are there, when you reflect back, are there moments where you personally felt like, shit, man, maybe game's over? Maybe game's over. Like, I really don't have the courage to.
A lot of times.
Multiple times.
A lot of times.
Multiple times.
And at that point of time, and let's say this wasn't the early days, but after you'd spent considerable time, right, and you actually got to scale, because that's what I find fascinating about your story is you always, because of the nature of who you are and how you build things, you always had customer love. It may not have translated into business, and that is when the rejection was. So you've got a product which has product market fit, may not have business market fit.
Yeah.
At that point in time, what did you tell yourself? And forget telling someone else, but how did you, the two of you, or you individually, have those conversations?
Look, I think usually whenever you have rejections, and when you pitch to a lot of investors and you go to
You
a
get
lot of
trained in
customers, that thing in an entrepreneur is that you have to always get over it and work on the next one, right? Because I think it's an essential entrepreneurial quality that you don't get bogged down by rejections, and keep believing that because all you need is one person to believe in you, right? And things fall into place. But beyond the point, and that's how you feel in the early days. But beyond the point, it just boils down to believing in yourself, right? And that's I think it took us a decade to realize that. But even as late as a year or two back, we've gone through those moments where you're like, is it game over, or is there the next big thing that's going to take us to the next orbit? And every time when that happened, we've done the same thing. We've first of all gone and told the team that, look, we're struggling with this, right? We got to fix this. Is there a way we can grow faster? And usually, the team has come up with such ingenious ideas, and that excites us back. We're like, wow, I mean, like, we could not have thought of all these things we can still do to drive even faster growth, and not just survive but thrive, right? And then you're like, why would I be thinking about all these? The next day you wake up and you're again, fighting that battle again.
In those tough times, we sometimes, when we look back, we feel that maybe we should have gone to people earlier, asking for help, rather than kind of just keeping it to
Because you were just
ourselves.
surprised at how
Because
easily help came your
yes,
way.
we were just surprised that the moment we opened up and we said this is the problem, people were like, hey, yes, of course, we're here to help, right? And they would solve our problem. And in hindsight, we always think we should kind of just
ask.
Just ask.
Fantastic. Great. You guys are working with now Chinese investors, right? And then of course it is a really large company, of course, a strategic one, so it has its at the right place. Have things changed considerably after that funding, for good or for bad?
So I think, look, we've been very lucky when it comes to investors, and I think most of the time it took us longer and harder to raise a round than we imagined it would. But every time we ended up finding, the highest quality of investors. So whether it's Safe or Sequoia or Fosun, we think that we have the right level of support and the best people on the board. To be honest, people who have actually built companies from scratch to IPO, and not just one but several of them. My 2 cents on this will be, it doesn't matter where the capital really comes from. What boils down to is the individual on the board, right? And
Yeah.
if your relationship with that individual and your ability to work with that individual to grow your business is there, I think you can leverage the most out of it.
And one of the things which affects the relationship is obviously the trust.
Yeah.
And like we said, bad news needs to travel faster than good news. It works both upstream and downstream.
Absolutely.
So in both directions.
Yeah, couldn't be truer. And I think that's a big takeaway from this conversation for entrepreneurs. Okay, on that note, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for being so honest and being so transparent, because I think your learnings are very, very critical in a world where there's just so much entrepreneurship porn that people think that this is like the coolest thing to do and the sexiest profession to have. but what it takes is just intense grit, and no one symbolizes that better than the two of you. So thanks,
Thank you,
Alok.
Ankur.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Rajnish.
Ankur.
Thank you for being our host. Thanks a lot. And with that, we come to the end of yet another episode of Building It Up with Bertelsmann, India's first growth-focused podcast. Please do remember to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, Savan, and catch the video format on Facebook, YouTube, and wherever else we're present. Until next time, I'm your host, Ankur Variku, signing off. Bye.